Welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and you're listening to a weekly podcast about books and life. Not necessarily in that order. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show on iTunes, or use our RSS feed with your favorite podcatcher. You can find the RSS feed on our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. We're also on Twitter, Instagram, and SoundCloud at VMSPod, on Facebook at facebook.com/virtualmemoriesshow, and on Tumblr at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com. We're also on YouTube, but the URL is impossible to spell out, so just go to youtube.com and search for Virtual Memories Show, and you'll find the last 60 or 70 episodes there. Now, you can support this podcast and get access to exclusive content with a recurring monthly donation via Patreon. Just visit patreon.com/VMSpod and set up your level of support. Every week you'll get new material from our patron-only blog, and you'll also get to listen to my quarterly bonus podcast, Fear of a Square Planet, which features extra material from our guests and is only available to supporters of the show. So visit patreon.com/VMSpod or paypal.me/VMSpod and help me continue to produce smart conversation about books, art, comics, and culture every week at the Virtual Memories Show. I'm posting this one at the end of Memorial Day weekend. I spent Friday through Sunday in St. Louis for my niece's high school graduation, came back a day early so I would have time to sleep all day, which is pretty much what I did. I just relaxed, got in yesterday evening pretty late, picked up the dog, came home, and today has largely been spent having a lazy day, not even a putting my contact lenses in day. So I have taken it easy, which turned out to be kind of necessary. Last week when I was rambling on about how burned out and stressed I was, I really needed a little bit of time, as it turned out. I'm feeling pretty good. I'm sure it'll all start over again tomorrow when Congress is out of session this coming week, so it might be a little bit easier for me in terms of crazy imperatives with what I do, but it was good not to have any of that for a couple of days. Now, as I mentioned, it was my niece's high school graduation, but I'm always on the lookout for podcasts, and in fact, met up with one during the weekend. I did not bring a recorder with me. I did not want to be tempted to set up a show and go through all the craziness of prepping and all that stuff. But I met a guy who I'd corresponded with a while ago, a good friend of my brother's, who has some interesting theories about Shakespeare and is also a retired teacher. So we talked a bit about the books that he's tackling now that he no longer has classes to teach. And I'm sure we'll have a nice conversation about that the next time I'm in St. Louis. Oh, I also met a guy who wants to take me on a tour of St. Louis's literary graves, which he promises will be pretty entertaining. I almost told him about the only literary graves I've ever visited, which were Proust, Oscar Wilde, and H.P. Lovecraft, but I thought he might get the wrong idea, so I didn't mention them at all. And I got to spend time with my family this weekend, which was nice, all sorts of crazy dynamics, but nothing to bring me down particularly. So, like I said, I'm kind of decompressed right now. We'll see what you guys hear from me next week, but for now, this is kind of an at ease Gil. This week's show is with a return guest, the great cartoonist Seth, who I recorded with back in 2014. Seth is one of my favorite cartoonists ever. My love for his work stretches back to pretty much right after I got into indie or alt or art comics, whatever you want to call them, back in college, really in the early 90s. Seth was part of the autobiographical comics wave, but his visual style, which looked like sort of mid-century New Yorker magazine work, really separated him from some of the scratchier cartoonists of that era, including guys he was really close with, like Chester Brown and Joe Matt, who he talks about in this episode. Seth moved, well, he put out a pamphlet comic initially called Palookaville, which is now a hardcover book, but he moved from autobiographical comics into fiction without exactly telling anyone, which led to some confusion when his first big serial story was about a version of Seth searching for a forgotten cartoonist who it turns out never actually existed, which I guess kind of falls into W.G. Sebald territory, but whatever. Anyway, it showed that Seth could kind of meld the autobiographical, the fictive, and the great wealth of knowledge he has of cartooning and illustration, and the great, I won't say nostalgia, but the great longing he has for certain aspects of the past into his comics in that era. Since then, he's spent years and years doing amazing work in comics and other media. And his current serialized memoir called Nothing Lasts might be my favorite work of his. It might also be fictional, who knows? Not that it matters particularly, but it's really just this wonderful meditation about his youth and childhood and the class sensitivity that he labored under, which I'd never really considered in his past work, nor in our previous conversation, but it kind of informs this one, as you'll see. Also, a documentary about Seth came out last year, and that also fueled my desire to sit down with him for another show. Still, we were going to both be at the Toronto Comic Arts Festival earlier in May. I asked him if he'd just like to do a little, so who you're reading, 10 or 15 minutes, or a full episode. And he sort of surprised me by saying he wanted to sit down for a full session. And in fact, before we started, he said, there's some things that I want to ask you, which, worried me a little. Even though I always tell my guests, this is a conversation, not an interview. So there's a little more of me in this one than in our first conversation. We also talked a bit during the weekend outside of the podcast session, in a way that I sort of hope leads to a correspondence outside of comics festivals for us. It turns out he did remember aspects of our previous conversation, has kept up with some of the shows I've done, and asked some really interesting stuff. So anyway, I'm not saying Seth and I are great pals or anything, but, I was kind of happy to have more of an interaction with him this time than simply my asking questions and sitting back. Now, the one caveat I have for this, besides Gil talks a lot, is that the power supply in the hotel caused a weird fluttering in my mics. Now, I mentioned that last week, and I tried to isolate it like I did with that episode with Kyler Roberts, but the results just came off way too tinny. So I decided to go with the audio from my backup recorder for this one, because I always have a backup recorder going. That's just who I am. Sorry if it doesn't sound as good as other shows, but there's less of the distracting, weird fluttering in the background. Plus, the levels are much more balanced because we were sitting equidistant from the backup recorder, where with the main recorder, I was a lot closer to the microphone. Anyway, I'm telling you way too much about what goes into the show. Here is Seth's bio. Seth is a cartoonist behind the long-running comic book series Palookaville. His books include Wimbledon Green, George Sprott, and It's a Good Life If You Don't Weaken, all published by Drawn and Quarterly. He is the designer for the Complete Peanuts, the Portable Dorothy Parker, the John Stanley Library, and the Collected Doug Wright. From 2014 to 2016, he partnered with Lemony Snicket on the Young Readers series All the Wrong Questions. He is a subject of the recent award-winning NFB documentary Seth's Dominion, and was the winner in 2011 of the Harborfront Festival Prize. In 2017, he collaborated with the musician Mark Haney for the musical performance Omnis Temporalis, and his Cardboard City installation was featured in the Art Gallery of Ontario's sesquicentennial group show Every Now Then, Reframing Nationhood. And now, the 2017 Virtual Memories Conversation with Seth. So it's been 3 years since we talked.
Yes.
I've got a whole bunch of things, but why don't we just launch into the, hey, what's new, Seth? What's the 3 years since we last spoke? How's your life?
Sure. Well, actually, I feel a lot has happened in the last 3 years. I mean, I don't know, I would be hard-pressed to just say, oh, well, in the last 3 years I've been working on this, this, and this. Mm-hmm. But I do feel that I feel like I'm in a later phase of my career than when I was younger. Or I don't really even like the word career, but you know what I mean? Like as an artist,
Progression.
I feel like I'm in a different phase of some sort, and that phase doesn't feel as connected to comics as it used to be. Mm-hmm. And that's not that I'm not still making comics and that I don't have new projects on the go. I think it's just I went over that hump that where you're no longer as engaged with the medium as you used to be. I remember years ago when I first met Kim Deitch, many years ago. I was much younger, and I remember talking to him about comics, and I remember thinking he's not that interested in what's going on at the moment, and I was disappointed. Kind of like I thought, oh, he's, and in Crumb, I felt the same thing from him, but now, and I thought, that won't be me. I'll be the guy who's always on top of everything, who's really interested in what's going on. But I think maybe this is a natural progression as you get older. You sort of retreat a bit from paying as much attention to the new artists coming up, and you go into your own world. And I certainly feel like I'm much more ensconced in my own little bubble now than I was even 5 years ago. I think the last generation of cartoonists that I was fully aware of would have been people like Michael DeForge and maybe Noah Van Schreiber. And after that, now I feel there's a great number of people I don't know their work. And I don't feel like this is a bad thing. I just feel like this is kind of maybe a natural progression I didn't see coming, that you sort of pull back a bit.
What was a moment of recognition for you? Or was it just coming to a TCAF and realizing, I don't know who any of these people are?
It was more realizing I haven't been going to the comic shop. I haven't really been going to the Beguiling in a long time, and I didn't feel like, that used to be so important. Every week when I lived in Toronto, I'd meet Chester Brown and Joe Matt at the Beguiling, and you'd be so excited to get the new comics. And I realized I'm reading more novels than I'm reading comics. I'm looking at more art books than I'm looking at comic art. My passion for looking at old cartooning has really declined. In fact, that's been declining for about 10 years. But I always say to people, when they're disappointed about that, other old-timey comic collectors, I say, I was interested in it for 35 years.
Yeah, you put in your time.
Yeah, exactly. It's like you move on sometime. But the funny thing about anything is once you get pegged as you're the guy who likes old comics, people expect you to stay that way always. And people will talk to you about things, and you realize, it's a disappointment to them if you say, I'm not really, collecting all those Dick Tracys anymore, or whatever it is. People, they want you to be who they think you are. And I certainly feel I don't like to disappoint people, but you move on sometimes.
What do you feel you're progressing toward?
I feel like I'm like everything, moving more inward into my own little bubble of working on my own work. I work on a lot of stuff that nobody ever really sees. It doesn't mean they never will see it, but I have a lot of little pet projects always on the go. Something that has been seen, it's my little cardboard city, for example, that I've been working on for, I think about 15 years now. That's just about finished. But there's other projects like that haven't, made their way out of the studio. I have a large grouping of paper cutouts I've been working on for years. And lots of little other constructions and things I'm making, sketchbooks, notebooks, all kinds of stuff that... it doesn't mean it won't be seen eventually, but that world of the studio is really where my interest is now. It's not the same as the classic cartoonist's approach to studio. Studio is just a place where you got the work done, and then the work was for publication, and you get it done and you crank it out, and then it's published, and that was. I like the world of the studio, which is the world of exploring ideas, where you do stuff and you don't have to show it to anybody. Maybe it's good, maybe it's not any good. Leave it alone, give it some time to figure out if it's any good. That process of exploring, I realize, is it's not something cartoonists learn, when you're young. It's a commercial medium. Right. And you come to it usually because as a child you were interested in commercial comics. And you idolize the fetish of the deadline and the monthly issue or whatever. Even in alternative comics, when they started, there was the idea that everyone was going to do these regular series of comics, which would come out once a year. But everybody thought they were working on it.
Still a schedule of some kind.
Yeah, I mean, everybody thought when they started, I'm going to put one out every 2 months, and then it'd be like you put 2 out the first year, and then 1 the next year. And then eventually it's 1 every 5 years. Mm-hmm. But I do think that idea of like the series, the schedule, the deadline, professional tools, this is like the fetish of the cartoonist, and a certain kind of perfectionism of line, and that's not the same world as the world of puttering around in a studio. That's more the world of fine art.
Yeah, how did you break out of that?
I think I just slowly eased into it, actually, rather than broke out. It's just a matter of expanding interests.
I was going to ask, was there a sense of dissatisfaction with
I wanted to do more.
The limitations of comics, I suppose?
Yeah, I think that's literally what it was, is there was always other things I wanted to, or there weren't always other things I wanted to do, but there started to be other things I wanted to do. I recognized I wanted to make more things. I wanted to, even just starting to design books was a big thing about 10 or 15 years ago, where I put a bit more focus on the idea of designing books. That was a move away from comics in a way, even though they're very connected. I think that was maybe one of the first steps where I felt there were other things I wanted to do besides just tell comic stories. Now I feel like telling the stories is part of a spectrum of work I'm doing. I would still, if anyone asked me what I would do, I would say I was a cartoonist. But I feel like there's a lot of other things. In fact, probably right now the thing I'm most interested in is taking photographs. But I wouldn't say I'm a photographer. I certainly wouldn't. If anybody said, what do you do for a living, or what are you doing, I would never say I was a photographer. And I wouldn't say I was a photographer for the other reason, is that I don't have the skill set to really say I'm a photographer. But I do like to take pictures. And that's probably, I think, for the last 2 or 3 years, been like one of the top 2 things I'm enjoying.
What do you like shooting?
I like shooting, how would I put this? Well, I never shoot people. Always just objects or places. And they're usually kind of tighter focus. I'm trying to work my way up to take photographs that have a bit more sweep in them. But I must admit, like shooting the landscape or shooting a streetscape, it's too busy for me. I like things really kind of rigid and well-ordered. So I tend to take shots of simple things, chairs, corners of rooms. Interesting, we drive around in the country a lot, and if I see, I don't know, an interesting electrical tower or something, I'll stop and take a photo of it. It's usually pretty iconic sort of imagery.
Road signs.
Yeah, exactly. And in fact, it's getting more and more mundane. I think when I first started taking pictures, they were pictures that you would expect me to take, old Art Deco buildings and, that's a beautiful, worn-out farmhouse or something. Now I'm starting to take pictures of, like, the hallway here in the hotel, for example, things that are kind of... I tend to think like the things that people aren't thinking to take a picture of anymore because they're so commonplace, but they will look interesting in 10 years. And that's actually a mis way of saying it. It's not that they'll look interesting in 10 years because things will change. That's part of it. The world always looks interesting once it changes. So you can take a photograph of anything, and in 50 years somebody will be like, oh, look at that chair in the hotel room. That's neat. I remember they used to have chairs like that. But no, it's more the blandness of it is starting to appeal to me. The idea that like these mundane areas are actually interesting in and of themselves. The corner of a parking garage or like the chair in your hotel room. It's a perfect example of something that is like does not look very interesting. But if you take a good photograph of it, suddenly everything's kind of evocative.
How have you gotten better? How has your eye gotten better?
You mean like in photographing?
Yeah.
It really has gotten better, and the reason it got better is the funny thing is because of digital cameras. Mm-hmm. I used to take like film camera. I used to shoot with film, and those were
with the big hood over your cell phone.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. No,
keeping the old-timey stereotype.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I used to just take snapshots, and I would take snapshots for reference. I'd go out and I needed to see buildings or whatever I was drawing. And those were bad photographs. And I knew they were bad photographs then, too, because I wasn't even thinking about photography. I was just thinking of I needed a picture of this building to draw. Yeah. But once I got a digital camera, I was planning to use it for the same reasons. But the thing is, you can take thousands of photographs with a digital camera. And just the sheer amount of photographs you can take, you start to get better. You start to realize, like at first, you just take a lot of photographs to cover your ass. Say like, okay, well, I've got all the angles I need if I have to draw this thing. But then eventually you start to think about taking photographs that are you see some of them are good, or it might be good.
Yeah.
And just over sheer volume of being able to take as many photos as I want, I started to get interested in taking the pictures. Now, I would still say I'm not a photographer and that I don't really know anything about my digital camera even. I know just enough to use it properly. But I've never been interested enough in technology to take that next step, which would be what a real photographer would do.
And you can go down a rabbit hole with that.
Yeah.
With any form. I mean, there's aspects of this recording setup that every so often I think, I could pour more money, the show sounds good. There's
Exactly.
nothing I need to improve outside of, showing someone that I have a nicer microphone. But
yeah. I feel the same way. I think, like with the photographs, I'm getting to a point where eventually I may do a little book of them. But I think that's because I'm interested in the imagery itself. I'm not interested in technology. The picture quality looks good to me because I like the way it looks.
Yeah.
I've never been a technical person. So it's like I almost feel like that's one of the reasons why I was a cartoonist, is that it is not a technical art form. It can be, but basically it's just paper and a pencil and some ink. Very simple.
Do you see yourself sticking with comics?
I do. I will always keep doing comics. I'm very excited about a new book that I'm just going to be starting in a couple of months. So, because I just finished Clyde Fans after 20 years.
I'm sorry. I don't mean to laugh, but come on.
I know. Well, I thought, I was at around 15 years. I was very embarrassed at how long it was taking, but at 20 years, I'm proud.
Yeah,
it's
now
funny.
It's an achievement.
Yeah, it's 20 years. It's kind of funny because I was so mortified. I never wanted to talk to anybody about it while I was finishing it because it was the ongoing joke that it would, never be finished, basically. But once it's finished, then you can be like, I told you I would do it.
There's a plan for this whole thing.
Yeah, exactly. Although I still am kind of like perplexed that I managed to stretch that out for so long. It was never the plan to I didn't say to myself, this takes the time it takes or something like that. I always knew that somehow it was sitting on the back burner while I was working on other projects, or it was always slowly generating, and it got to the point where I felt no push to finish it. I just knew it'll be done when the day comes. And so it's done. Yeah. And I've been, I had 20 years to plan the next book. I had 2 or 3 books in my mind that I was probably going to do. And then this is a funny thing, how these things work. Literally, within the last month I was working on Clyde Fans, a whole new book appeared in my mind that was almost entirely written and was actually more thought out than the books I'd been thinking about for years. And so that will be the next book.
When you talk about that process, do you see, when you say the book's written, do you see the writing of it, or are you visualizing it in the process also? Do you see the style in which it's going to be done? Are there aspects? Okay, having no visual imagination whatsoever, I wonder, how those things appear to someone who actually can create.
Yeah. So. Well, it's funny. I see it. I probably see what's going on in the book somewhere in between imagining the real world and my drawing style. So it's not one or the other. It's I do see the figure, the main character, walking through the town, and I kind of imagine a real person walking through the town. But on the same time, overlaid it is the reality of thinking about how you'll draw it. And so there is it's kind of like those corny things you see in documentaries sometimes about cartoonists where they have some computer program that takes a picture and then turns it into a drawing. Yeah. That's which I hate. Yeah. But it's kind of like that you're kind of doing that in your brain. But the final finish of what it's going to look like, that I'm not so sure, because my style has been getting more perfunctory over the years. And I've been doing a lot of work lately that's very minimal. Working with rulers and a lot of black shapes and stuff, and I'm starting to think I might go that direction rather than the sort of lusher brush style that Clyde is finished up in. Mm-hmm. I don't really enjoy doing that work that much. It's funny how I spent 20 years learning to use the brush, and now I'm kind of disinterested in it. But that is the most appealing style when I apply what I call the full style. Yeah. But it's I also have sketchbook style I do. It's very simple now, just magic markers, which is more pleasing to do because it's more fun. It's less work. So I'm kind of torn about what approach to do, because I know if I do it in the more fun style, it'll be done quicker. If I do it in the full style, well, it'll be slower. Okay. So we'll see.
Are there hybrids of your drawing? I mean,
Yeah.
I know it's a spectrum.
There's a
of the
spectrum.
type of
There
stuff you
is.
do, but does it really fall into those two poles? I suppose
It does kind of, yeah. But I mean, on some level, there is like this choice where you say, I'm going to make it. Well, actually, where the hybrid is commercial work. Commercial work is where you give it the half-hearted attempt. You're like, I won't give it the full effort, but I'll make it look slick and professional. Those are the words that I hate to apply to my real work, slick and professional.
You mentioned a documentary. One of the practices of documentary, turning artists or the real world into an artist's drawing. You did have a documentary about you that came out last year.
Yeah, I think it was last year.
Yes, that's the
something like that.
Within the last year or two.
Yeah.
Were you afraid of a Zwigoff-esque Crumb sort of expose of the inner life of Seth? And B, how'd you feel about seeing your work animated in the documentary?
Well, the first one I knew it wouldn't be Crumb-like because first of all, the guy who was directing it too was like so obviously wasn't going that way. Yeah. In fact, I might have been happier if he'd been a little harder on me. When we first started doing the documentary, we weren't connecting at all. Like I was actually quite bothered by it at first because, I mean, when we did the first take, it went fine. We did about 15 minutes, everything went fine. I thought this will be great. And then after that, it was like we didn't have a rapport when we were on camera. He would ask me questions, and I would. They didn't feel like questions I wanted to talk about, or it wasn't that they were personal. It was just there was something lacking in what was going on.
I've had episodes like that. That's okay.
Yeah, and it's funny that.
Not this one, of course.
Yeah. It's funny that like I just thought I started to get a lot of trepidation over because I mean this took like 8 years. We went through this process, and there was a lot of that. And I was really worried this is going to be a boring documentary was my main worry. Somehow I didn't feel like I was really like, I don't know, it was just, I wasn't interesting in it. Mm-hmm. And this brings us to the second question, the animation. It's the animation that I think saves the documentary, really. I mean, I'm uninterested in watching myself talk on screen. I find that all that stuff, even if it was more interesting than I think, I don't know, I'm not interested in that. But I did like the animation, actually. The funny thing is I didn't even know he was going to do animation until near the end when he said to me, the animation is coming along well. And I was like, the animation? Yeah. I said, I didn't know you were doing any animation. He was like, oh, you agreed to that in the beginning. And I thought, well, first of all, that doesn't sound like me. Since, the funny thing is to slight digression, during the making of the film, we were not friends, the director and I. I found that I kept a real distance from him somehow or other. I was pretty sure we weren't going to be friends either. But after the film, we became very close. It's funny. I realized that probably psychologically, I just couldn't be friends with him while we were making that movie.
Sure.
But I realize now from knowing him better, I think he was lying to me about that. He's a very aggressive, smart kind of guy. And he once told me that when somebody says to him, don't do something, that's the first thing he does. So I thought, so he did the animation. He did ask me because he knew I would say no. But he did a great job on the animation, especially considering, too, that there is a fair amount of computer work in that animation. And I probably would have been very hesitant if he'd said, I want to do this animation and use computers. I would have said that he could only do it if it was all hand done or something, which would have been impossible for him.
Cells from 1910.
Yeah, exactly. So, no, I was happy with it. I think he did a good job. And I would almost wish the whole film had just been animation. And that now I would almost, if I could go back, I'd say, let's forget about the documentary. Let's just make an animated film.
Had you ever thought of doing animation previously?
No, in fact, I love animation, but I hate the idea of, I would often say scornfully, animators. Because I found that generally, I didn't like the aesthetic of animators when I met them. They were, everything I've complained about with cartoonists being like a world of professionals, animators seemed worse. And I always thought, what a horrible career. It's like you do all this work for 5 minutes of, to get it on the screen. I'd seen people struggle. And I just thought, no. And I wasn't interested really. I love film, but I really was not interested in the idea of making a film or making an animated film. But after I saw this, I did think, that's interesting. It made me, because it was my own work, it made me think, I watched what he had done, and I'm like, I like how he's paced this. I like the way he's dropped in certain points where it's like, it's like how the movement is, how the timing, the music, the sound. I thought, that's interesting. I never really even thought, I don't think in those terms in comics.
About all of those elements.
And I have been thinking of maybe in the next couple of years doing something small, maybe just a very short, 5-minute animation or something.
Again, which will take you 2 years of your life to...
Well, I will probably do what I would do is hand it off to them. Yeah, exactly. Outsource.
Yeah. I was of two minds, I guess, watching it. There's a sense that your work has always been about the stillness to me, so seeing it moving was it was just strange. I suppose.
I mean, I thought that was strange too, because it's weird to see someone else imitate your drawing style, and it doesn't look right to you always.
Yeah.
I've had lots of people say, wow, he did a tremendous job, he got you done perfect, and I'm just like,
well,
no, I don't think so. Yeah.
But did you find it affecting in that respect?
I did. It's funny. This is the weird part. Watching that animation, and recently out in Vancouver, there's a classical cellist, or not cellist, he plays a double bass, and his name's Mark Haney, and he wrote I'm hesitant to call it an opera based on George Sprott, but it's operatic in some of its elements. It's a musical performance, let's say. And recently I went out there and they staged this, and I built a stage set for them, and they did this performance of George Sprott. And the reason I bring it up is much like the animation, when I watched it, I was amazed in both instances that I was emotionally moved by them. And I was like, it's funny because I'm certainly not emotionally moved by my own work. And you're too close to it. You know what you're trying to do, but it doesn't really have any emotional effect on you. It's interesting, though, when it's filtered through somebody else and your own stuff comes back to you, it can affect you.
That sense of collaborating. Because ultimately... saying in shorthand, what you do is a solitary pursuit. And both of those involve a collaborative aspect, not just of your work being adapted, but all those other people's work coming together to make something.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting experience. Pardon me?
Do you see something in that? Does it make you think about doing collaborative work?
Not really, no. I really am too much of like a homebody that way. It's stressful for me to go out and like actually work with people. I like the end results, but I do find I'm always happier just to be alone in the studio.
As a micromanaging control freak, I'm totally down with that. But no, I just wasn't sure if this experience has made you
let me ask you a question that I was going to ask you, which was, how many people do you think you've interviewed now, like roughly?
I've done 216 or 17 episodes.
Okay.
Some of them were multiple, but yeah.
Have you become any wiser talking to people?
Yes. I know when to shut up a lot more. I was just telling someone, I did not have musical instrument, art, sports, or anything like that in my youth. So this is the first thing I've ever done repetitively and recognized that my skills at it have gotten better.
Okay, that's interesting.
There are skills to this. There's always the unpredictability of the other person, but there are a lot of things about doing this every single week that I have gotten better at, and that have informed my day job when I suddenly have to get up and do a public speaking thing. I can do that now because I do this every week. There are things I've gotten better about. There's things I've learned from artists. Sometimes it's interesting to me coming back to someone a few years later and seeing how their perspectives have changed, or just things that they thought were the most important thing a few years earlier. Perhaps aren't.
I wonder how many people can even remember what they were thinking or saying.
No, that's why I go back and listen. I was surprised earlier this year. I sat down with Brad Gooch. He has a book out about Rumi, the great Persian poet.
Yeah, of course.
We had done one a few years earlier, and he remembered aspects of that conversation that I remembered because I listened to it before I got together with him this time, so I had background, and he alleges not to have listened back to it. So
that's interesting.
Yeah.
Well, I guess that's either that it's had more of an effect on the conversation was more memorable to him than most conversations are. Because who remembers a conversation you had 3 years ago?
Or 2 minutes in my case.
Yeah, exactly. No, it's pretty true.
My fear is that I will destroy one of you guys someday by accident, that I'll make some comment about your art that'll be, after I spoke to Gil, I never did another comic page again. And then I'll
it's funny. There are people that such things have happened, but usually I think it's a review more than an author.
Yeah, which I wrote something about Richard Sala many years ago, over 20 years ago, that I'm still embarrassed about because I discovered in a Comics Journal interview we did a year or two later. he took it personally, and I was just some schlub from New Jersey trying to be funny, and that was wrong.
You got to develop a thick skin, though. If you're putting your work out there in the public, it's like you can't control what people are going to say about you. You have to. I mean, there are comments that will stick or sting, and you will remember some things forever. I always remember Chris Ware told me once, and I thought this was true. He said, if you're looking up your own work on the internet, you'll keep keep looking until you hit something really mean. And then you'll say, I should stop looking.
Right.
But it's like you will keep looking until that mean thing, because the good stuff is, you're always looking for people praising you. And
but you don't believe them because...
you never believe them, but you still like to hear it.
Yeah. But that one negative one is...
that's the
exactly
one you believe.
how wrong
Yeah.
I am.
No, they peg you, and then you remember that. You're like, oh, even if they're not right, you suspect they're right. So that's the problem.
It was one of the, and again, this is long before all this stuff. I wrote a review of Zoot by the Langridge brothers.
Oh yeah, I remember that.
And it was a very positive one. Yeah. And it may be BS, but one of them did say later that, we weren't sure if we were going to keep doing what we were doing, and we saw that review and thought, oh, somebody gets this. They understand what we're up to. Let's keep going.
That does happen. No, it's true, especially back in those days when there was so little attention.
And I didn't realize how fragile you guys all were. Again, I was just a 20-something.
Yeah. No, well, I mean, we probably weren't much older. Yeah. It's funny. Those were, the great thing about those early years was actually exactly that it was a small world, and that because that gave you the room to grow. Like, you were in the public eye, but not really.
Yeah.
I think like everybody from my generation was producing comics for a few thousand people, really. And that was like still enough people that you got the attention that gave you the encouragement to go on. People would write you letters, whatever. Yeah. There would be a review in the Comics Journal. That might be like the only place where anyone would mention your work. Pre-internet, of course, so nobody was like, posting unsolicited reviews that you'd never, Yeah. And it was interesting being out. I actually feel like it's probably a lot harder for young cartoonists right now who come out and they have to like try and put out a graphic novel right away and hope that they can get a review in the newspaper. They're hoping for a review in the New York Times or something. It's like that was nothing to hope for when we started. The New York Times was not going to be reviewing any alternative comic books back then. I think when Mouse got the first review in the New York Times, it was like something that all comics celebrated. There was like a little comics parade probably somewhere.
But seen as a giant exception.
Yeah, oh yes, absolutely.
But this is
also, we were stupid enough to believe like, oh, the door's opening.
Yeah.
And strangely enough, it did. But looking back, it's like the door wasn't opening. It was opening for Art Spiegelman. But they weren't about to start reviewing Doofus next week. Now, maybe they would.
Would have been awesome.
Yeah.
Still love me some Ultragot, man.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, me too.
Yeah. I've got a friend who knows him up in Rhode Island who, always, you've got to come up sometime. We have to get together with Rick. And I've just never.
Yeah. No, he's an interesting guy. I don't know him well, but I've always liked him.
Yeah.
The other question I was going to ask you is when you've talked to a lot of different people. How would I put this?
Bluntly.
Do you just talk with some people and you're like, this person is like much more interesting or much smarter than other people? Or does it all kind of equal out where you think everybody's kind of the same?
No, I do find, I always look for the little crenellations, and there's the smarts and the way they interpreted their life and their experience.
Mm-hmm.
It's why early on, I had some publishers pitching me on, and I boil it down terribly, a 30-year-old who college, MFA, worked in publishing, has a first novel out. I don't care about that person. I don't care how smart they are. They just haven't lived enough.
Yeah. No.
Whereas I want to sit down with Sam Gross and talk for 2 hours, because guy's had a life.
Oh, I bet. Yeah.
He's seen a lot, not just in terms of, being in the war, et cetera, but seen cycles go by.
Yeah.
Sitting down with Bleckman a few weeks ago, same thing. It's a guy who, it's such a wild and varied life, and stuck with art, the entire time. There are people who are surprisingly smart. I will say, because I've said this to him in person, I thought when I met Glenn Head that he was just some leather jacket knucklehead who happened to be good at drawing comics, and I read his comics and thought, these are actually really good. We sat down and talked, and he was so much more thoughtful and a good reader than I was expecting. We bonded over George Orwell.
Okay.
And I totally didn't expect this. I thought, we're going to talk about
I can see where you're coming from. All I know of Glenn Head is from his work, and I would just assume exactly
and
what
meeting
you're
him
saying.
at a party, it was the same. He
Yeah.
kind of grunted and was
Yeah.
friendly, but we didn't connect.
Yeah.
And we sat down in this sort of scenario. He actually came to my home, and we had this really good, smart conversation. I've stayed in touch since then.
That's another good point, I suppose, which is that this gives you an opportunity to actually talk to people in a way that you probably never would have.
Yeah.
It's like the guy at the party is just grunting at you. I know in that instance, I'm just like, I don't want to talk to them, really. I mean, like, it's just somebody like, oh, yeah, this doesn't look like a person I'd be interested in. We probably have nothing in common, and that would be the end of that, and you probably never speak to them ever. But in this context, you're talking to this guy and realizing you're going into people's real worlds, I guess, into their head, whatever, and that's interesting.
And they only get to experience me for an hour or two, so they don't realize how incredibly shallow and disappointing I truly am. So it kind of helps in that respect.
Yeah.
It's just these bite-sized exposures of Gil. They don't get to find out the true emptiness that lurks underneath it all.
It must be funny, though, to talk to somebody for just an hour or something, though, and then, because it's an intense experience of like, well, let's talk, not just like sitting down at a coffee with the awkward talk. The other person has a microphone in front of them. They have to rise to the occasion. Yeah. They have to speak.
Generally.
Yeah. I mean, I'm sure there are some people that are...
And those are the ones that will never air.
Yeah.
Well, the thing I tell people when they ask, can you do this by Skype?
Mm-hmm.
I said, no. This is about two people. It's a line from Frank O'Hara, the only truth comes face to face. And I've even said, I don't care what people tell me so much as what they reveal in the course of just who they are. But I was telling someone yesterday, I do this because it's two people who can't get to look at their phones for an hour.
Yeah. Well, there's no worry here.
I know, with you in particular, not an issue.
Yeah.
But that sense that, you're not... One of the funny ones with Dan Perkins, Tom Tomorrow, we did a show just when he had launched the Kickstarter for his big 2-volume 25 Years of Tomorrow book that turned out to be so successful when he was expecting it to, barely eke out the number he was trying to hit. It quadrupled that over time.
That's great.
But I recorded with him. He'd already blown past the limit. It was Sunday he launched it, and Tuesday we did our show. He had already blown past within 24 hours, and I could tell that he sort of wanted to get up and go back to his studio and hit the refresh button, see what the number was. But we did a good conversation anyway. He was just sort of Gil, you can understand why I'm a little distracted. I'm like, yeah, because you are discovering that you have an audience that's bigger than you thought and more affluent than you thought, that they were willing to put this money up.
Yeah, I guess Kickstarter is a funny thing because, I'm hesitant to even think about something like that because I always consider that's like, it's kind of like getting your IQ tested. Yeah. It's like you might be disappointed to find out that you're not as smart as you think you are. Kickstarter is like exactly the kind of thing. It's like, it's great if it turns out like that. Yeah. But what if it turns out the other way, where you have the confirmation people aren't interested? Yeah, or they don't have money, or you launched the wrong time. Greg Preston, the guy who does he does photos, portraits of cartoonists and artists in their studios. Okay. He launched one election week in the U.S. And surprisingly, nobody was really paying attention, and it died. So he relaunched it a month ago, and he hit his limit, did just fine. In Dan's case, what was interesting was, and it's something that I think all cartoonists deal with. In his case, he's editorial cartooning, syndicated. Mm-hmm. And all I've been hearing for years was, you have no audience, we're cutting your strip. Oh, yeah. So he was going into this with, Jesus, I have nobody, this is going to be all, and discovers this huge profusion of people. Because it's one thing to get an email. It's another thing for someone to say, here's $50. It's a big difference. I mean, people are willing to buy your stuff. It makes a difference. Yeah. And so he discovered that those editors, they were going off some metric that, they were saving money on running his thing. I wonder if the Kickstarter might not be like the bad review. If that could not be something that like a young artist could be so totally disappointed by that it turns you right off. Yeah. I think we talked a little about... the whole social media thing, in terms of what you were talking about with, having a cohort of cartoonists who were all knew each other, but were also, I don't want to say supporting each other, but critiquing at least. Yeah, definitely. As opposed to, I'm putting it up there for the entire world, and all they have to do is keep hitting this like button. Yeah. Does it enforce a certain type of work that isn't necessarily growing? Yeah, I have a feeling that that's one of the problems. I mean, I don't, everything's from the outside that I'm criticizing because I'm not really paying close enough attention. My wife's on Facebook, and I see her put things up and then be happy when people like them. I wonder if like the like button isn't like a little dose of soma or something. There's a feeling. I could imagine if I was a young person, I would want that positive feedback so much that it would definitely steer me in bad directions, maybe. The good thing about when back in the 80s working in alternative comics is that you had to lower your expectations. You didn't expect that you would be getting a lot of feedback. You didn't expect you would get more than a couple of letters for an issue, and maybe you would get a review in the Comics Journal. There was no guarantee that they would even cover what you were doing. Sure. And you just got used to the idea of focusing on why you were doing the work. And the work was, you were doing the work for your own reasons. And, of course, you were influenced by other artists. And, of course, you were trying to imitate work that you liked, although you were trying to hide that fact. You never want anyone to know who your influences are too clearly. But I do think that was a good path. Somehow or other, that I do believe when I look around the cartoonists of my generation who made it, it's a pretty diverse bunch. At the time, it felt like we were all working in the same stream. But now I realize that you couldn't have artists much different than, say, like Chester Brown and Chris Ware or Joe Matt and Joe Sacco. I mean, but at one point, they felt like they were all in the same stew. It's like we were all like working in this tiny little world of publishers and fans. Even myself, I always thought like I was doing work that was very similar to Chester and Joe, and now I think like my work's not like Chester Brown or Joe Matt. Yeah. They're quite different. So I do think that there was something that helped create a strong stream of individualism. Even though I think we all started maybe from the same point, it really pushed you inward.
Did you see yourselves, were you defining yourselves in a sense as we're not mainstream comics and therefore we're all lumped together? Or did you see yourselves progressing out of the undergrounds and the kind of moribund 70s era?
It was a bit of both. I mean, I do think that it depends on the artists. I know certainly myself and Chester and Joe talked a lot about how we had grown up with the mainstream comics and then had moved away from them. There was a strong sense of rebellion against them in the early 80s, and I remember that that's one of the reasons why autobiography was a big central point at that time, was because it was a strong desire to get as far away from fantasy-based content as possible. I think what's interesting is that slowly over time that faded away as the confidence grew amongst our generation that we were no longer being defined by mainstream comics. So you see Dan Clowes do something like The Death Ray. I don't think Dan would have done The Death Ray in 1985.
No.
Because he needed to put some distance probably between himself and mainstream comics. Sadly, that would have probably got him pegged in there as with The Rocketeer or something.
Yeah.
It was like that strange middle world of comics that were not supposedly mainstream comics, but were really just slightly more adult superhero comics.
Yeah, that was a line I remember an old Alan Moore interview in the Comics Journal where, and it might be showing a certain limitation in the way Moore understood things, or maybe just the time itself, where he felt that, if the mainstream guys had any brains, Dan Clowes would be doing a Jimmy Olsen comic and Jaime Hernandez would be doing Wonder Woman.
Yeah.
Which I think, and again, this is going back to someone saying something almost 30 years ago, might betray a lack of understanding about what those guys really wanted out of their art.
Exactly.
That their goal wasn't, someday I'm going to be a DC cartoonist. Dan was not.
Yeah, I know. The funny thing about that was there really was that attitude out there, and there were people who worked in the mainstream who thought they were pretty hip and they would like to have got Jaime to do a cover or something, but that showed me that they didn't really, as you say, they didn't really understand what we were trying to do. I think this is the other side of that question about what we were thinking back then, is that yes, there was a reaction against the mainstream, that we wanted to make sure we weren't seen as doing that kind of work. But the other side was I think we felt somewhat united, although I think it had been hard-pressed to get anyone to say they were united back then, but somewhat united in the idea that we were trying to make real work, to write stories that were, closer to what writers do. Rather than just try to create properties.
We'll say literary in quotes.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. I found that the term art comics has come up in the last 20 years, and it's a good term, I think, because it's kind of vague, but it implies, it's actually, maybe it sounds more like it's focused on the visual rather than literary comics. But I think art comics is a good term because I think that's what we were trying to do, and the next generation has more naturally just done it. which is just make comics that are an expression of being an artist.
Yeah.
And that was the thing that the mainstream people didn't understand. They still don't understand that, I think. They still think that, like, you know, the death ray is a good property.
Yeah.
And that's basically...
How do we franchise this?
Yeah,
Like
exactly. Yeah.
Listen, I had a friend who pitched me on a pal of hers. She's a writer in Hollywood. She said, my friend is the DC executive who's in charge of all the Green Lantern stuff, and he writes this and that, you know, do those comics.
Yeah.
You should record with him. And I was like, I don't know what I would ask someone who devoted their life to superhero comic. I know it sounds snobbish, but I can't.
The funny thing is, that stuff only gets interesting with time. It's like I would probably like to talk to the office manager at DC Comics from 1955.
Yeah, you know, that guy.
But not now.
Well, I will tell you, actually, one of the great episodes of this show that made me think of you, and the genesis of it was when I was in deep despair and thought I was going to give up the show. I ended up interviewing Al Hirschfeld's archivist.
Oh, yeah.
David Leopold, and that rejuvenated my faith in doing the show. But he then connects me with, and this is literally 2 hours after we meet, he said, you know who you have to record with? My friend Ben Modell. He's a silent movie accompanist.
Oh, that's interesting.
I was like, my God, David, how do you know me that well? That I'm not even being sarcastic. That is exactly who I want to sit down and record with. And we end up having a long conversation that on the face of it appears a little dry, but underneath you realize it's all about that guy in 1955. In this case, it's that guy in 1920. It's all about the way technology changes, audiences change, what it meant to be the second biggest guy in the world 80 years ago, and now nobody has any idea. Marcel Perez, not quite Fatty Arbuckle level, and then, you know, just disappears, and nobody has any idea. So that whole thing is all subsumed under this conversation. It's absolutely wonderful. And that, when you ask things that I learned, that episode in particular taught me a great deal about a lot of aspects of, you know, what it meant to build an audience, what it means to interact with them in the moment, to interact with them from something in the past.
It's true. I've often thought about that period of when sound pictures came in, and often thought about how strange Hollywood must have been, that in the years following there must have been a huge number of people who'd been very important silent stars who literally were out of a job.
Singing in the Rain. That's our, you know.
And it's funny because there must have been that process of where they transitioned into normal jobs, working in cars. That to me
is the biggest question that I would long to ask most people I talk to. How the hell do you make a living? And again, silent movie accompanist. How do you do this?
I know.
He teaches, he gets flown to places to play, and, you know.
I'm always amazed that somehow or other everybody somehow makes it to the grave without, like, dying of poverty. You know, especially in the arts. I mean, they have tough times, and, you know, but somehow everybody struggles through. You do hear, you know, people like late in life artists, sometimes it really is penniless. But in fact, is there any... there's hardly any artistic biographies that don't end with, like, ruin. Which is not a good reason not to read them.
Pfeiffer was doing fine, had a late divorce, which I think kind of caused some issues. I wonder, I guess that's the issue of how many of them have to keep working until the end, which of course will lead to the question if you're doing okay, right?
I'm doing okay. But you know what's funny is everybody worries about that, though. It's like, when do the opportunities change? Like, the miracle is you always thinking that all the time. And I think, like, I was thinking that 20 years ago, like, is this going to dry up next year? And here it is, it's 20 years later, and everything's still fine. Everything's going good. And I still think, like, how many more years till you find yourself in trouble? Typically, like an artist, I don't have, you know, I haven't been socking away like a fortune for my old age. The day will come where you don't know what's coming. It's like you could get sick. You just count on keep working. But those two things that are, I don't worry too much about it, but the two things that are scary are that either you will get too sick to work or people will not want you to work anymore.
Right.
Those things do happen. And certainly the story of the old cartoonists is always depressing, which is the old guys who work for their whole lives in comics, and then they end up, you always see them.
Taste change in there.
And you see them, like, when they're old, they're especially if they're Americans, they're begging for money because they need health care. They don't have any health care, and all they've got is, like, you know, 5 old inked pages left because the company stole all their work. That's grim. And I think that's an object lesson I never wanted, to be one of those guys.
Again, asking something somewhat personal. Do you make more from design work at this point, or do the comics sustain what you do, and don't
Yeah,
you don't have to talk
In fact,
about
I'd say it's all over the place now. I feel like my money comes in. I don't think about the money as much as I used to because I think just generally doing better than I used to. But it's like there's enough money coming in from a variety of sources. I get money from doing commercial work, like designing books. I get money from galleries where I have work on display. I always surprised, like a check arrives and you're like, oh, there's money in this too. There's grants. You get money from applying for grants from the government. There's Canada has a great thing where every year a check arrives and you're like, what's this check? Oh yeah, the libraries just pay you money for people taking your books out.
Oh, okay.
There's all kinds of stuff, and all these many little sources that you do a piece for the New Yorker, or you get money from your books, of course, the publisher, and it's like somehow or other this all adds up to enough money that you're doing all right. I suspect everyone's always dreaming of like some big, the giant check that will come in, like maybe someone will option something, but that becomes less and less likely as you get older. You start to realize, like I think when I was younger, I used to think like, oh, somebody might make a movie of It's a Good Life If You Don't Weaken. It seemed like the kind of thing that might happen. I don't think that's going to happen anymore. I don't feel like I'm producing any work where somebody's going to say, like, this would make a good movie. I think it might even be that the movies aren't the same even anymore.
Yeah. That if they were, it would be some small indie thing. Maybe
exactly.
Wilson is as big as it gets.
Yeah. I think Dan is interesting. He's somehow positioned himself or been positioned by the kind of work he does, that his work has like I wouldn't say a saleable quality, but it's like a filmmaker might look at that and see that that's
quality.
Exactly. Yeah, and I just literally do not think I'm doing work like that, and I don't imagine the work will be any more like that in the future. In fact, it'll probably be less. Mm-hmm. You realize if it's one thing you realize as you get older is that you become more yourself, and the stuff that is like something like that. That's any aspect of my work that someone might point out and say like this is quintessentially what your work's about. It'll just get more like that, not less.
Yeah. What have you discovered besides that discovery? What have you discovered about yourself as you reach that age? Like, who have you seen that? Wow, I did not realize I was this guy. I mean, last time we talked a bit about the old timey guy is an act, and then it becomes the persona. But
it's funny, not to get too it's hard because it's like it can be very personal, and if anything, I would say that I was. You go through phases of self-discovery in your life. Lately, I've been feeling, doctor. I feel like saying doctor. Lately, I've been feeling.
Trust me, my Carol Tyler episode is the most Gil the therapist one that's ever happened. But they come up periodically with this.
No, I feel like it's funny. You go through. I was just through a period, I would say, of about 10 years where I felt very confident, kind of like knowing where I'm going, feeling happy with who I was and. What I was doing. And I would say that in the last year or two, I felt a certain, like, that bubble start to burst. And that I feel that may have been a kind of blind confidence, which underneath is a certain feeling of foolishness. It's hard to put this into words, but it's like there's a lot of bluster in my personality. I talk a lot. Mm. I can sit down with somebody and just, like, talk. And often I do, talking over people. And then I leave and I would feel confident, like I'm fine. I'm always good. I'm a social person. I can handle things. Now I'd more likely get up from that table and think like, wonder if I wasn't a fool. Or wonder if this person, not someone that you think likes you, maybe they don't like you that much. Maybe, in fact, they don't like you at all. It might be a realization that... trying to come to terms with your personality. That might be why I like so much to be in the studio, is that you only have yourself to deal with. Your personality when you're alone is quite different than your personality with others. In fact, I wonder if we would even know ourselves if we didn't see ourselves reflected off of other people. When you're alone, it's like you're comfortable with who you are. It's natural. I mean, you might dwell on things, but most of that is interactions with others. What do I dwell on that would bother me when I'm alone? Things I might feel embarrassed by.
Things you once said too.
Yeah. Exactly. I'm never embarrassed by anything I'm doing with myself. I'm always happy with myself. I'm my best friend. It's funny. But out in the real world, I feel like an increasing sense of doubt at dealing with others, and I do feel I am retreating somewhat from that. I feel less connected to people. I feel I never talk to any of my friends. I've literally entered into that category that happens with men when they get older, where they only talk to their wife. And then when those guys get divorced, they're like, I don't know anybody anymore. Right.
I tell this is my conversation. Yeah. I live in the house I grew up in.
Oh yeah, that's right. I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, see, you remember stuff from 3 years ago, which again makes me feel terrible. But yeah, I've got friends there, but nobody I can have this sort of conversation with. Mm-hmm. And it's 25 miles from New York, and that's why I go in and do shows there. But there's a degree of I set up calls during my work. I work at home, so I set up calls with some of my clients so that there's some conversation. Because the more time I spend without some sort of interaction, crazier I get. But yeah, there's a degree of withdrawal like that I can understand.
Do you feel like do you feel you have a different impression of yourself now than you would have 10 years ago?
I feel just in the last 3 years, because I created this new job for myself and have discovered a lot in the process of that about who I am and how I deal with people. That I overcame some hang-ups that I'd had over the decades of my life that were largely father-related, which spun out of no longer having coworkers or any male figure in my life that I had to work for any sort of approval from. And then beyond that, I discovered I was engaged in a 10-month-long negotiation with the FDA and other industry parties, and I learned all sorts of things in the process of that about how I interact with people. But near the end, something happened where I and another industry guy, FDA, brought something late to the table that was going to change the numbers of everything we had done. And my reaction was to open about 8 different spreadsheets and try to change some other parameters so we could make things work. And my pal instead blew up and started screaming at them that they can't add this thing after the fact, and we've already ratified the agreement and blah, blah, blah. And so they pulled back and changed it. And that was a big moment for me because I realized I'm the guy who just tries to make people happy. Yeah. John's the guy who says, fuck you, you can't do that. Yeah. We already agreed to something. And I thought, sometimes you need to be that guy. My instinctive reaction isn't to be that guy.
No,
I didn't really know that.
I understand that. And that's not my instinctive reaction either.
Yeah.
But it's true that, well, it's funny. It's good to be both guys.
Oh, yeah. But you need to have sometimes your first reaction needs to be that, and mine isn't. And so it's good that we made a good team during the course of this thing. But
that's funny because that is the kind of thing that I exactly would feel the same thing. There are times where literally I feel like I would...
you screwed me? Well, let me just try and figure out how to make this screwing go by a little bit.
Yeah, exactly. It's that is where you feel later kind of humiliated too, that your desire to please others has made you be the weak one in the situation. Yeah. And I think I certainly have done the same thing myself many times. I'm always proud of myself when I do the opposite. Yeah. But that's the thing. There's something about being a people pleaser that you get in childhood somehow from certain kind of upbringing. I'm not sure exactly what does it.
I'm going to say your father, the relationship you had with your father. You just didn't want him to be mad.
Yeah,
and again,
exactly.
not to be your therapist.
Yeah, no, that's true. That's a good answer. It's true. And then those skills are useful later in life. Yeah. They are good they're good in relationships often. But they can be very detrimental too.
In business, it can be bad. So I'm still learning that, or at least how not necessarily to be the raging guy immediately, but how not to be the pleasing guy immediately. Yeah. You asked what I learned from doing this show. It's not talking. It's the moments of stepping back and letting the other person talk.
It is interesting. I was just talking last night to someone about that very thing because we were talking about relationships, and I was saying my wife and I have been married 15 years now. And so we've gone through several phases of how we interact with each other, and we've got to know each other obviously a lot better. But somewhere in the middle of our relationship, I guess about 5 years ago or something, let me say that she's not. She's a talkative person, but not that talkative. She's actually a quiet type, and so I felt that it was my job to entertain her when we were out. And it's because I talk a lot, so I would just talk. And in fact, I probably think that period made me start talking twice as much as I normally talk. That I would gather things up during the day in my head as subjects, and when we would go out for a drink, I would tell her about the novel I was reading. I would talk about what I was working on, what documentary I watched, blah, blah, blah. I'd have a lot of stuff to entertain. And then after about 5 years of her listening to this, somehow or other, I kind of came to the realization that this was exactly the wrong thing. She enjoyed listening to me. Yeah. She was always very kind about it. But I was like, she wants me to ask her questions. That is what she's been waiting for. Mm-hmm. And then I started to say, like, I would, of course, asking her what book she was reading, but I would ask, like, a little deeper. I'd say, like, why do you pick the kind of books you pick to read or whatever? And then she would start talking more, and I realized, this is what she wanted. It's like I completely had the wrong approach. And it's like it took me years to figure it out. It's not like she was sitting back there going, will you shut up? Yeah. But it's like
the long suffering.
Yeah, I think she didn't know what she wanted either there. And I figured this is like probably the process of being involved in a long-term relationship. This is the longest I've ever been with anyone. It's like after 20, 30 years with someone, I can imagine that there is much of this where you say like that period 10 years ago when this was going on or blah, blah, blah. And that is pretty interesting in your own life, to see that happening.
And she didn't throw anything at you during
the time? No, not then. Maybe at other times.
We should bring up, because we're closing in on when you have to be down at TCAF.
Yeah.
We're at TCAF. Who are you interested in seeing while you're here? Besides your usual suspects.
Yeah, I mean, that's probably, the truth is, it is the usual suspects. I'm not, like I said, I'm not paying as much attention as I used to. I'm not really too sure who's here. Yeah. I do know that when I come to something like this, the biggest pleasure I have is talking to the couple of people I've gotten to know over the years that I genuinely think of as friends. Mm-hmm. So I was talking with Joe Ullman last night. Joe's someone I've become much closer to. As close as you can get when you're 50-year-old friend. You know, you're both 50.
You're too old to make new friends.
You're not friends. You don't make friends when you're old the way you did when you were 20, because you don't hang out enough.
Right.
I think that's the essential element of having a friend is spending time together. And if you don't spend the time together, then I guess you're kind of acquaintances. But Joe's a good acquaintance. I like seeing him. And, of course, I'm here to see Chester Brown because we don't see that much of each other anymore. And probably, there's a couple other people. Like I bumped into Noah Van Schrijver, and he's somebody I enjoy talking to. And who else? And Michael DeForge. These are all people that if I, get a moment to spend some time with them, I'll be happy.
I forgot to bring up the other big, we'll say life-changing thing in the past 3 years. Your publisher left.
Yeah.
Chris Oliveros. How was that for you?
Well, it's funny. I guess I would say on a day-to-day basis, it's not been noticeable because I didn't deal with Chris that much in the last 10 years. I went through a long period where I was dealing with Tom Devlin, and then after that I spent most of my time working with Tracy Huron. And Chris was in the background. I would see Chris, at different events, and I always loved Chris. But on a day-to-day basis, I didn't notice. But I'd noticed, well, the company's different under Peggy and Tom than it was under Chris. But that had been happening for quite some time. They have different tastes. And I feel like the company has gone a certain way that is closer to Tom and Peggy's vision now than less of what Chris Oliveros was about. I still feel they've kept all the integrity of the company. The company still stands for the same kind of quality and care. But the aesthetic's slightly different. But like I say, that had been happening even before Chris left. I guess the strangest part about it is that I feel like it's the end of an era when he left.
That's what I was wondering if that...
It did.
Like that.
Oh, it did. I mean, that he was like an essential part of that comics world that we came from. He created much of that comics world by creating Drawn and Quarterly. Those early years with Drawn and Quarterly were totally different than... Like now, Drawn and Quarterly is just a publishing company in a way. It's like... a young person would probably think of Drawn and Quarterly like they might think of Chronicle Books or something. It's just it's another imprint. Drawn and Quarterly was like a guy in his bedroom when we started. I mean, I would go to Montreal and sleep on Chris's floor. When Chris sent me out on the first book tour we ever did, it was literally like we were phoning each other from phone booths. Like I'm calling him from like Vancouver or whatever, and he's telling me like whose apartment I'm going to be staying in when I get to Seattle or whatever. It was very, a very different world. But now, it's like Drawn and Quarterly feels like, just any, real publisher. They have publicists and they send you on a tour, you arrive and somebody meets you and takes you to a hotel, and it's like, it's a different world than it used to be. It's the world that we were dreaming of in a strange way.
But are you nostalgic at all?
Not really. It's funny. I am a nostalgic guy by nature. I'm nostalgic about everything. And so as I talk about it, there's a little bit of nostalgia. But the truth is, I don't want to sleep on anybody's floor.
Cool. We'll send you downstairs to TCAF.
Okay.
Seth, thanks so much for coming back on.
Always a pleasure to talk to you, Gil.
And that was Seth. He doesn't have a website of his own, as you can imagine, but you can find out more about his work by going to the website of his publisher, Drawn and Quarterly, and searching for Seth, which is spelled S-E-T-H. You should check out the documentary Seth's Dominion, which is available on Amazon and iTunes. His new issue of Palookaville, number 23, is dynamite, and I can't wait to see what he does next. It was so interesting to hear him talking about not just the comics, but the whole, idea of the studio as this creative incubator for him, but also that notion that all the books that he'd been planning to do while finishing this long Clyde Fans serial turned out to be not as important as the one that occurred to him right near the end. So whatever he does, I'm sure it's going to be pretty high quality and some amazing comics. Now, once we wrapped up the main session, I asked Seth, so, who are you reading? And that led into a really interesting conversation about Anita Brookner, who I have not tested out yet, but it is really worth listening to. But if you want to hear it, you're going to have to become a supporter of the Virtual Memories show so you can get access to our bonus podcast, Fear of a Square Planet. You can do that at patreon.com/VMSpod or paypal.me/VMSpod. I've got all sorts of goals and goodies in place for supporters of the show, including that podcast, patron-only blog, handwritten show notes for every episode, and a series of ebooks I'm still hoping to launch if I can just get some time to figure out the formatting and all that work. So anyway, go to patreon.com/VMSpod and support the art of fine conversation. This episode was recorded at the Toronto Marriott on Bloor, which is a wonderful hotel except for the power supply when it comes to XLR microphones. But I'll deal. Half of the trip was a business expense because I visited two of my trade association's member companies that weekend, but the rest of it was still a bunch of money for half the airfare, hotel, dining, etc. This was all centered around the Toronto Comic Arts Festival, which I mentioned at the top of the show. If you want to help defray some of the costs of the Virtual Memories show, like web hosting, travel, and equipment, then visit patreon.com/VMSpod or paypal.me/VMSpod and make a one-time or recurring donation. Now, special thanks go out to Kevin Katila, John Wendler, Fred Kish, Jonathan Kranz, Wallace Wilde Manozzi, Andrew Mason, Greg Tanner, Garrett Zecker, Craig P. Steffen, and Ron Slate for going over and above in their support of the Virtual Memories show. We've got the full list of show supporters at chimeraobscura.com/VM. Now, our music for this episode is Nothing's Gonna Bring Me Down by David Bayerwald, used with permission from the artist. David has a reunion project going with his great 80s band, David and David. You can find out more and support that at facebook.com/DavidandDavidMusic. And that's it for this week's Virtual Memories show. Thank you so much for listening. We'll be back next week with another return guest, the photojournalist Kyle Cassidy, who has a new book out called This Is What a Librarian Looks Like, and it's fantastic. Until next time, you can subscribe to the Virtual Memories show and download past episodes at the iTunes Store or at soundcloud.com/VMSpod. You can also find all our episodes and get on our email list at either of our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. You can also follow the Virtual Memories show on Twitter and Instagram at VMSpod, on Facebook at facebook.com/virtualmemoriesshow, and at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com. And if you like this show, please go to iTunes, look up the Virtual Memories show, and leave a rating and review for this podcast. That'll help us build a bigger audience. Till next time, you've been listening to the Virtual Memories show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and you are awesome. Keep it that way.